Welcome to Powerhouse Arena. We have been in Dumbo for 30 years, and it is events like these that make independent bookstores stay alive and in business. So we thank you for coming tonight. Tonight we're here to celebrate cancel culture, free speech in Gaza, a conversation between Norman Finkelstein, Nadine Strossen, and Cornel West. Norman received his doctorate from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. For many years, he has taught political theory and the Israeli-Palestine conflict. He is the author of a number of books, among them Gaza, An Inquest into Martyrdom, Method and Madness, The Hidden Story of Israel's Assaults on Gaza, Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End, and What Gandhi Says About Nonviolence, Resistance, and Courage. A long list of books, all of them great, all of them you can buy here today, and I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. West.
Well, thank you for coming out this evening, and I feel very fortunate that both Nadine Strossen and Dr. Cornel West were able to make it. I know both of them in a kind of an eccentric way. Nadine Strossen formerly was the former executive director president of the American Civil Liberties Union, and that was a long stint. It was how many years? 18 years. I was at that point in my life a person of the radical left, and so I wouldn't brook liberals, so I had no interest in the ACLU. However, Nadine Strossen did stand out for me because of an unusual episode. It was reported in the Times that during the period when there was a lot of concern about objectification of women, Nadine Strossen was asked her opinion on the subject, and the New York Times story quoted her as saying, "Well, when I pass construction sites, I like it when the workers whistle at me." So I thought to myself, this is a person of independent mind, and I filed it away. We ran into each other another time, and she handed me her book on hate speech, which I think I've now read 4 times. And in the process of her handing me her manuscript, the book wasn't yet published, I handed her my manuscript for what became the book on cancel culture. And I remember her reply. It was a reply after my heart. She said it was side-splittingly funny, which for me is the highest of compliments. But then she went on to say, I think I had more agreement with the second part on academic freedom than I did on the first part. Now, I'm not sure where she stands currently, but I am certain that one chapter in that first part on former President Barack Obama did not rub her the right way. And so I'm very happy to have her here. And Dr. West, we are of the same age cohort, and at one point we were in the same academic institution. And though, of course, I knew him by name, I had, to my knowledge, no contact with him until fairly recently. I asked to interview him, and then I did my homework assignment, and I sat down. I said, give me your 5 most important books. And I sat down and I read them. And I have to say I was I was kind of both dazzled and humbled. If it's okay, I'll call you Cornel at this point. He not just has a staggering range, but it's the depth of detail. And on the few subjects where I was knowledgeable, the detail was right. I was just very surprised by that. On any topic on which he alights, he doesn't know just as broad generalization or bromides. He gets the detail right. And that, to me, at any rate, was very impressive. He, too, read the cancel culture book. And I remember his comment. He said, "Brother Norm, those footnotes, they go on and on and on." And that told me something about Cornel. He reads the footnotes. He does. He's a serious reader. And I have to say, I really respect that. I would just say in defense of myself, the really long footnotes were quoting W.E.B. Du Bois. And I wanted people to read. Du Bois was a first-class mind, but he had a totally different approach to how you deal with these subjects than what came to be the cancel culture. He freely admitted problems in the African American community, but he spoke very confidently as he admitted it because he thought it can be explained. It didn't require cancellation or evasion. You just patiently explain. And that particular intellectual modus operandi completely vanished. What we'll do today is I want to cover 3 topics. First of all, the topic of what is freedom of speech in our country. And I think many people here will be quite surprised by what, at least formally, freedom of speech comprises in the United States. Then I want to look at the effects of the cancel culture or the wokeness, and how, in my opinion, it both eviscerated and deformed the tradition of freedom of speech in our country. And then the last topic I want to look at with Nadine and Cornel is, for me, just a kind of serendipity. Most of my adult life was devoted to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and in particular Gaza. And then I wrote the book on cancel culture and freedom of speech and academic freedom. And then by some serendipity, after October 7th, those 2 topics intersected. The issue of Gaza got caught up and is currently caught up with the whole issue of freedom of speech and academic freedom. So I want to devote most of the evening to that 3rd topic, but I first would like, together with Nadine and Cornel, to lay the foundation. Now, just speaking very briefly, in the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled many things that will surprise, I think, people in the audience. Number 1, the Supreme Court has ruled that you are allowed to advocate the overthrow of the government. You're allowed to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. Now, I know that for sure because in my youth, I spent a large part of it advocating the violent overthrow of the government, and I never suffered any legal consequences for that. In fact, my very first job interview after I graduated college, the first question was, do you advocate the violent overthrow of the government? I passed that round of the interview. In our country, you have the right, it's a protected right, to burn the American flag. That case went before the court in 1989. The then Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a very anguished dissent. The flag was very precious to him, that was clear. But the court majority ruled that burning the American flag is a form of what they call expressive conduct or symbolic speech. In our country, the court ruled a young man walked into a Los Angeles courthouse and he had emblazoned on his coat, "Fuck the draft." The court ruled that's legal speech. It's protected by our Constitution. Our court ruled that the Nazi Party had the right to march through a predominantly Jewish community in Illinois called Skokie. In fact, there were several cases, and in one case, it was devoted to one very specific question. Does the Nazi Party have the right to display the swastika in Skokie, which, as I said, was predominantly Jewish, and there was a significant minority of Holocaust survivors? Court ruled they had the right. The court even defended the rights of, believe it or not, 8 and 10-year-olds. 8 and 10-year-olds, they wanted to wear during the war in Vietnam the armband, a black armband, which was a form of protest against the war in Vietnam. The court said these 8 and 10-year-olds have the right to wear that armband as a form of protest. And then lastly, the most recent case, if I'm not mistaken, there was a military funeral, a funeral of a military personnel. A religious sect, it showed up at the funeral or within its environs, holding up signs that said things like, "Thank God for dead soldiers," "Fags doom nations," "Priests rape boys," "You're," meaning the dead soldier, "you're going to hell." Believe it or not, the court said that's protected speech. Now, I believe in the wake of the whole cancel culture, all of that was forgotten, regrettably. And what I want to do to begin with is to ask Nadine, who wrote on the subject and has spoken a lot on the subject, can you just tell the audience what are the limitations of freedom of speech in our country?
Thank you so much, Norman, and it's wonderful to be sharing the platform with you and with Cornel West. What a great honor, and especially that so many of you turned out for this very important subject. For those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading Norman's book, I highly recommend it, not only because it is indeed side-splittingly funny, but it also is crammed with wisdom, with information, with thought-provoking ideas. And I must admit, I have read some of the footnotes, not yet all of them, but I truly intend to go back and deepen my understanding by reading those as well. So Norman has given you cases that illustrate the very strong speech protective nature of modern Supreme Court First Amendment free speech law. And I emphasize modern because for most of our history, the First Amendment with its free speech guarantee was a dead letter, you know, along with the Equal Protection Clause and other wonderful language in our Constitution. It is not self-enforcing. It is not self-executing. And it is not until people have an understanding of what their rights are, so they know when those rights are violated and can go to organizations such as the ACLU, the NAACP, many others, to stand up and advocate their rights that those paper guarantees, as James Madison, the author, well, he used a different term back in the day in the 18th century. He called them parchment, mere parchment barriers between we the people, our freedom, and government abuse. So they were finally turned into a reality starting in the second half of the 20th century. No coincidence, at the very same time that the Supreme Court was breathing life into the Equal Protection Clause in the cauldron of the civil rights movement. If you go back and you look at the great First Amendment cases, a huge percentage of them came out of the civil rights movement because government considered that expression to be incendiary and subversive and traitorous and dangerous and emotionally disturbing, all of the negative adjectives that we hear about controversial expression today. Norman asked me to tell you what the basic principles of free speech are. You could take a full semester-long course that I and many others teach on the subject, but it truly can be boiled down to two fundamental principles. And one of them, I think, is quite clear from the examples that Norman gave you. The Supreme Court has called it the bedrock principle of freedom of speech. Lawyers refer to it as viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. Government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the content, the message, the idea, no matter how unpopular the message is, no matter how hated it is, no matter how hateful it is, that alone is never a justification for suppressing it. If you hate it or you fear it, then do something. Use your own free speech rights to refute it, to debate it, or maybe to ignore it and not let the speaker get any traction that way. But it is not for government to take those decisions about good ideas, bad ideas, etc., away from we the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution. Now, the complementary core principle, the second one, is often referred to as the emergency concept. When you get beyond the content of the speech, its message, its idea, its viewpoint, and you look at it in its overall context, if in all of the facts and circumstances that speech either directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm, then it can and should be punished. So, and some of the examples of speech that satisfy the emergency principle will sound very familiar, I think, to many of you. Intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently. Targeted harassment or bullying or intimidation, where the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear in the targeted audience members that they will be subject to attack, and that's a reasonable fear. And let me mention one other category of viewpoint or content neutral regulations that are therefore permissible. And this terminology has been floated around a lot in the context of all the debates about campus protests. Content neutral time, place, and manner regulations, right? So even though government can't pick and choose certain messages to be suppressed, it can say, well, you may not blare anything, we don't care what the message is, with a loudspeaker in a residential neighborhood late at night or on campus. You may not block access to certain facilities on campus. You may not shout, no matter what you shout, in a library or a classroom that disrupts the primary purposes that those places are used for. So if I can just give one concrete example to tie together Norman's points and my points and relate it to the theme of Gaza and the protests. Thank you. Happening in the Middle East. As I've told Norman and many others, I really am not interested in parsing whether particular phrases or expressions should be categorized as anti-Semitic or as advocating genocide, because those classifications are completely irrelevant from the perspective of First Amendment freedoms. You have the right to make anti-Semitic statements and other hateful statements. You have the right to advocate genocide along with other forms of violence. It's only if it reaches the point of intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently that it's not protected. And I don't think anybody has claimed that any of the expression on campus has reached that justifiably high threshold.
You're fine. Oh, no problem. I would just want, before we proceed, to underline what Nadine Strossen just said, because it's a very radical, it's a radical statement though, but it's also in our jurisprudence. She said you have the right to advocate anti-Semitism and you have the right to advocate genocide. In many respects, that's sort of the end of the discussion. It means everything that the assault that's gone on against the universities is completely illegal under our constitutional system and as it's been interpreted. However, I do believe one should treat the questions discreetly. Whether or not what's being said is anti-Semitic, and then even if it is anti-Semitic, is it still protected speech? And I believe that first question is still important, and we'll get to that. I want to ask Cornel a slightly tougher question. And as Nadine pointed out, everybody understands there's a distinction to be made between speech and conduct. And speech is very heavily protected in our system. Conduct obviously raises altogether different questions. So you have the right to advocate the violent overthrow of the government, but that doesn't mean you have the right to violently overthrow the government. That's the area of conduct, and the rules completely change. Now, with that in mind, and I'm genuinely curious. I sent Cornel and Nadine the outline because I didn't want any gotcha questions. I wanted to hear them think it through. I personally enter one caveat to this categorical support for freedom of speech, because it seems to me that there is a difference between having a conversation with somebody where there's an exchange, even a very emphatic exchange of opinions, and when you're talking to somebody who's a war criminal, who has blood in their hands. And I believe that to allow that person freedom of speech on a college campus is a form of desecration of the dead. And I don't consider that acceptable. Even the most categorical of atheists, if you read, for example, when Marx was buried, his daughters were very careful about the flower arrangement being retained at his gravesite. It's called respect for the dead. And I think it's a desecration of the dead to allow a person who has large amounts of blood on their hands to be able to speak. Now that can be a Henry Kissinger, for those of you who hail back to my era, or it could be a Jean Kirkpatrick, or it could be in an article that Nadine passed to me, she mentioned that there was attempts to silence Hillary Clinton when she spoke at Columbia University. I guess it was last year or maybe 2 years ago. I will have to say, in my opinion, that's a borderline question. But let's hear what Dr. Cornel West has to say. Is it, in your opinion, a form of desecration of the dead to let them speak?
Yeah, I don't have a absolute yes or an absolute no. I always proceed through the lens of a historical struggle for freedom, in which, from my vantage point, it would be hard to find a U.S. president who could speak anywhere, who could not be characterized in some sense as a war criminal. Starting with the slaveholders. Harry Truman, 290,000, Nagasaki, 350,000, Hiroshima, Vietnam, LBJ, 565 drones, Barack Obama, Trump, gangster to the core, facilitating whole waves of attacks on on precious folk, you see. So that that's just so broad that I would want to begin first with our acknowledgement that this is the 58th anniversary of the death of the great John Coltrane. 40 years old, July 17th, 1967, the last day of the uprising in Newark, where 26 folk were killed. Mary Baraka in jail. 6 years later, Detroit, 46 people will be killed as a result of an uprising. Why is that important? Well, it's important because for me, you see, I come from a tradition of a black freedom struggle, the heroes that both of y'all acknowledge, the Paul Robeson, the Du Bois who live right around the corner from here. Actually, Arthur Miller bought the house for him and handed the keys to Du Bois because black folk couldn't live in that section of Brooklyn at that time. Now, Du Bois did pay Brother Arthur, but Arthur Miller, not just a great playwright, but he was committed to what the three of us attempt to be committed to. That's why I love these brothers and sisters, even when I agree and disagree with them. They got courage, they got consistency, they got what Jane Austen called constancy. They say what they mean and mean what they say. You don't have to worry about posing and posturing and saying one thing and going in another direction when it comes to their deeds. So the lens through which I look at free speech is from a black folk who could not even worship God under white supervision in churches for 244 years. So it didn't make a whole lot of difference what you put pen on paper if that's the level of your praxis. And then for another 100 years, neo-slavery, the lynchings every 2.5 days. So John Coltrane, Love Supreme, this modern musical psalm of gratitude, and the lament of Alabama, saying what? Let's keep track of what's happening on the ground. Not that what's happening on paper is unimportant, but is always circumscribed by the powers that be and the mechanisms of repression and execution of what is on paper. Because you can have the most sterling words. Look at the Soviet Union Constitution. They had every kind of possible freedom in the world. And you look on the ground and see what Solzhenitsyn's got to say. You don't have to agree with his right-wing ideology to know the brother was telling the truth in terms of the suppression of people who were raising their voices. Well, the anthem of black people is lift every voice. And the greatest tradition of the modern world, the black musical tradition of artistic genius and spiritual fortitude and moral courage, is finding your voice, not just being an echo. If all you're going to be is an echo, when you lift your echo, you're just extension of a silo. No, you got to find your voice. So that finding your voice is not just free speech, but it's what put Socrates in jail, what the Greeks call parrhesia. That's frank speech. That's fearless speech. That's unintimidated speech. That's plain speech. That's the language of Malcolm X. That's the language of Ida B. Wells Barnett. That's the language of Frederick Douglass. Ida and Frederick Douglass raised their voices and what? Had a bounty on their head. Thank God for Scotland. Thank God for England. They were able to escape. You see? So that when we talk about these issues, we have to be very, very concrete in terms of what mechanisms are in place for execution and forms of repression. Because nearly every major voice of the black freedom tradition has been either assassinated, literally, in terms of their character, marginalized, livelihood taken away, like Robeson, like Du Bois, like Ida, like Frederick Douglass, like Martin King. We can go on and on and on. And it's not because skin pigmentation is tied to some kind of virtue. We know a history of black thugs and cowards and gangsters and collaborators. It's a question of integrity, honesty, decency, courage, trying to be true to what you say and being willing to live and die for something bigger than your own ego. And so for me, when you talk about war criminals, good God Almighty, shoot, I've been to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I've seen a whole parade of war criminals. And they're not just presidents, they're not just elected officials, but they're the ideological rationalizers of the misery, of the socially induced forms of suffering and domination. And it comes in all colors, every nation, every empire, every social experiment. I hope I don't go on too long. So the direct answer to your question is, I believe in the anthem of black folk, which is lift every voice, which means even these thuggish, gangsterized war criminals like a Trump, like a Biden, like an Obama, they have a right to spread their lies. I fight for their right to be wrong, because in the end, I'm deep libertarian. People have a right to express their wrong, but we will show up as we did at Princeton when the racial IQ folk came in, black people less intelligent. We will show up, protest on the outside and on the inside, expose the intellectual dishonesty, the indifference, and the same would be true for those who try to rationalize genocide, rationalize mass incarceration, rationalize patriarchy, rationalize transphobia, or whatever form of evil it is. You have to have a robust public conversation about it.
That was brilliant. I want to add one really important point, which is that freedom of speech is, and this was implicit in Brother West's eloquent preaching, that freedom of speech is not only the right of the speaker to convey information and ideas, it's the right of the audience members to hear and to engage. And the first time that really important concept was articulated in this country, it was by that brilliant constitutional philosopher, Frederick Douglass. He was shut down when he was trying to give a pro-abolition speech in Boston, and many of my students are shocked. What, Boston? Yeah, even the liberal Northeast considered abolitionist speech to be dangerous and subversive and seditious. So the thugs shut down his speech. He gave the speech later in another venue, and what is powerful, eloquent pan to the powers of free speech. And among other points, he said, when you shut down somebody from speaking, it is a double wrong. Not only robbing the speaker of the opportunity to tell us who he is, my goodness. If somebody's a war criminal and supports it and is running for office or is in office, don't we want to know that? But it also robs us of the opportunity to hear it and the opportunity to question it. So to your concrete, specific question, Norman, I would say, it all depends. If somebody, a war criminal, is invited to get an honorary degree and to be fawned over about how wonderful he or she is, I would say no, the university should not do that. But if the person is invited to an open forum where maybe there's somebody else debating him, but certainly where every audience member is free to ask tough questions and to make counter arguments, that can have to me, that is respecting the dead rather than desecrating them.
I don't want to prolong this. I will simply register not an emphatic no, but I will register the conviction or belief that I don't believe those responses engaged fully with the question. And I don't. If you take a concrete example, so Germany after World War II, aside from some very high-level prosecutions, most people got off. You were a concentration camp guard, probably after the war. Maybe became a student in college. You got a lot of blood on your hands. Now, a student group decides to invite this concentration camp guard who has a lot of blood in his or her hands and decides, let's hear the German side of Auschwitz. Let's hear that, in the part of that postmodern cancel culture garbage, talked about there's no such thing as truth, there are only narratives. There are only narratives. So you invite this person to give the concentration camp guards narrative on Auschwitz. And then sitting in the audience is somebody whose family was tossed into a gas chamber and then was incinerated. I find it a moral abomination. You can talk freedom of speech all you want, but in that, and I'm telling you, I consider it a separate category. If you don't have blood in your hands, you can say anything. And anybody who's been a student of mine knows in my class, I am going to be very forceful about defending everybody's right to have their say. But this is a very distinct category. Now, Cornel is correct. It means a lot of people. It does. Because where do most of these presiders over murder, where do they end up? They end up teaching at Harvard, they end up teaching at the Kennedy School, they end up at Stanford, that's where they end up. I recognize that, it's a large number of people. And I still emphatically believe that's a desecration of the dead, and one has to be mindful of that when defending the right of speech. Now, the argument with the burning of the American flag was those who voted in the Supreme Court that it was a right, they say it's the best defense of our country if we let them burn the flag. That shows our confidence in our country. That's a fine argument. The problem is a flag is an inanimate object. It's an inanimate object. When people have been murdered, incinerated, gassed, it's a totally different moral question. And I find it unacceptable to not take that into account. And I'm surprised Dr. West didn't take it into account.
Oh, I took it into account. I just disagreed with you. I think I got a better argument than you have, though, because when you talk about moral abomination, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But if you and I agree that the pool is so broad, because we're not just talking about politicians,
Soldiers.
we're talking about professors,
Yes.
we're talking about journalists,
Yeah.
we're talking about TV stations, Supreme Court justices. This thing is pervasive. We're talking about pastors, rabbis, imams.
No,
Where does it stop?
That speech.
Where does it
that
stop?
speech. I'm talking about a very special category.
Yes.
People who have blood on their hands. Speech,
I
totally
intellectuals.
agree.
I think intellectuals have blood on their hands when they're justifying
I think
vicious
it's-
attacks on
no.
people, though.
And
brother.
I
think
don't,
it's a
and I
different
don't think
category.
I do.
It's
See,
a
we
different
disagree on this.
category.
We disagree
Yeah.
on this one, though, brother.
and I don't
I
think
think
you're-
I'm right. I'm not a relativist about this.
And I don't think you're endorsing anything that they've done or anything they've said by inviting them. Among other things, I am to me, the greatest way to honor the dead is to do whatever we can to prevent this abomination from happening in the future. And one of the ways to do that is to try to understand what motivated those criminals.
I have no problem with that, and that was
Yeah,
the
I agree with
argument that Nadine made in her book with regard to Skokie, when the Nazis marched in Skokie, that this is as it were, a learning moment. But those weren't real Nazis. They didn't exterminate anybody. There were a handful of wackos, I think the number was about 30, a handful of wackos in Skokie, Illinois. I don't see how you cannot see the distinction between burning a flag, some wackos marching through Skokie, and people who are drenched in blood.
Norman, I see the distinction, but where we disagree is what is accomplished by stifling them from speaking.
Respecting the dead. How about that? Respecting the memory of the dead. I think that counts.
And I do too, but I choose to honor the dead in what I think is a more proactive, maybe more optimistic way, that we are going to use the opportunity to learn about, to argue with, to increase the likelihood that that kind of blood on the hands is going to occur in the future. So to me, that's the way to honor the dead.
Okay.
Respectful disagreement.
Nobody agrees with me on this point, but...
No, I think your insight is crucial and the challenge is profound. It's just that the conclusion is different than what we draw, that's all. If we respect the dead of oppressed folk from the beginning of time, the public sphere would be empty. There's very few who would have the right to enter that public space who would not in some way be complicitous and have a duplicity with forms of structures of domination and oppression and degradation and hatred and greed. So that I agree with your analysis, I just have this lift every voice, Johnson Brothers sensibility that says we still have to listen to the voices, allow people to enter the public space, and go at them tooth and nail.
I don't want to belabor this point because we have a lot to do tonight. But I don't believe anybody I don't believe anyone faced with real life circumstances actually believes it, okay? So I'll just return to Cornel. So you remember the famous lynching, I guess it was that fellow named Sam Jose, was it? Sam
Hose.
Sam Hose.
When Du Bois is walking down the street and sees his knuckles there in the window.
So for those of you who aren't aware, lynchings were not carried out for the most part. They weren't carried out by night. It wasn't people holding torches.
That's right.
They were picnics. Factories were let out early. School children were let out early. The mother packed the picnic basket. They all went down to the campgrounds. They lynched the person, set the person on fire while he was being lynched. And at the end, they auctioned off the body parts. And then the body parts which were auctioned off, the person who purchased it, they made postcards of them and then sent them, okay? So, if it were your father, Dr. West, if it were your father, Sam Hose, and then they decide to invite the people who burned him to death to speak at your school, would you just limit yourself to a protest? I don't believe it.
As opposed to what? Just kick his behind?
Saying he's not being invited.
Crush him, or what else? What's the alternative? What's the alternative?
Just what they did with Hillary Clinton. He's not coming. Too much blood in your hands, you're not coming. Because that's desecrating the memory of my father.
Yeah.
But Norman,
I don't believe you would defend it.
The counterexample that springs to my mind, thank God I don't have personal experience with this, are those amazing people in Charleston, South Carolina, who forgave the guy, the white supremacist, who murdered in cold blood their loved ones. I've done a lot of work against the death penalty, and one group that just has me awestruck is a group called Murder Victims Family for Reconciliation, where the father or the mother or the brother or the sister or the daughter of somebody who's been murdered goes to prison and befriends and forgives and becomes a friend of, so I mean, to me, that I aspire to that, and they see that as honoring
That's
their
very
dead.
beautiful. I'm not a Christian. Never to forgive, never to forgive, never to forget. Full stop. Let's move on.
Oh, no, but then, wait, but just be honest with these black Christians now. The black Christians are not saying never to forget. See, I had a great uncle who was lynched in his military uniform after fighting in World War I in Texas. And my mama come out of that same family in Mount Zion Baptist Church, and she got to deal with the family who did the lynching. What are you going to do concretely on the ground as a human being tied to integrity, honesty, decency, and a willingness to somehow make sure you never forget some form of accountability, but at the same time not just going out responding to terrorism by somehow terrorizing on the other side. Those who do decide, as my grandfather did, he pulled out his gun. He was head of the deacon board. He pulled out his gun. He said, it's time to engage in some, what we call these days, counterterrorism against the dominant forms of terrorism. That's called armed resistance. There's a rich tradition of that. There's a long tradition of that. It is as human as anything else. But there's other voices in the community that said, Big Daddy, that's not only strategically dangerous, but morally, we just don't want to reproduce the same cycle of violence. We don't want to reproduce the same counterterrorism, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, leaves everybody blind and toothless, so we're going to engage in other forms of resistance. Every oppressed people has a variety of voices in terms of how they resist. Some of them are like Granddad, violent, just like U.S. Revolution. Some of them are highly creative and courageous. Others are cowardly and deferential. They want to sell their souls for a mess of pottage. Same community. Every community has it. Iran, Palestinian, Jewish, Black, Irish, Catholic, we can go on and on, indigenous peoples, feminists, so forth and so on. Now, given that, they had to have a conversation within that community, and then you're going to still have some of the folk with blood on their hands, brother, showing up in a conversation. What you going to do?
They're not showing up. Let's move on. I want to now just turn to the question of, the second question, the question of cancel culture and wokeness. Now, as I think is obvious to everybody in the room, when the cancel culture set in, it was preceded by the political correctness culture. The cancel culture was somewhat different because the political correctness, for those of you who remember that era, first of all, the expression political correctness was coined by the left itself to mock this politically correct approach to politics. Cancel culture was very different because cancel culture was appropriated by the Democratic Party. And then there were real institutions, organizations backing it. And then it became what was an object of mockery. It became a real menace. And in my opinion, at least one of the hallmarks of the cancel culture was to cancel that whole tradition of freedom of speech, which was so hard, so fought, it was such a difficult struggle. Most of it, Nadine mentions, a lot of it came out of the civil rights movement. But the fact of the matter, when the tradition was first crystallizing at the beginning of the 20th century, it was mostly people of the left who were fighting for those rights. It was anarchists, socialists, communists who were fighting for that right to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. And so that whole tradition began with the left. Now along came this, in my opinion, pseudo-left, and it replaced what Nadine described as the principles of viewpoint neutrality and the emergency principle, namely when it starts verging on actual conduct, and you can restrict it. It replaced it with speech could be canceled if a particular group felt unsafe, unwanted, or uncomfortable. Those became the new guiding principles. It was no longer viewpoint neutrality. It was no longer the emergency principle. If a group claimed that a particular speaker was making them feel unsafe, unwanted, or uncomfortable, that speech should be silenced. And until fairly recently, that was pretty pervasive. In my opinion, President Trump capitalized on those resentments at that standard of speech, and the expression, a broken clock is right twice a day, I think he was right on that issue. The cancel culture was a menace. Now, in researching the book, I read a lot of W.E.B. Du Bois. And while I was thinking about the cancel culture, I came across a passage in Du Bois. Just give me 1/2 moment. Put this down. Good. Du Bois was a first-rank scholar. He attended Harvard, but at that period in time, Harvard was kind of a backwater. It's not what it is today. If you wanted to seriously study, you went to Germany. And so Du Bois went to Germany, and he studied with the most famous German historian of his era, a fellow named von Treitschke. And Du Bois writes as follows in his memoir. There were 4 memoirs. He didn't realize he would live so long. He writes, "One day, Treitschke, he startled me by suddenly declaring during a lecture on America, mulattoes are inferior. They feel themselves inferior. I, meaning Du Bois, I felt as if he were pointing me out, but I presume he was quite unaware of my presence. However, my presence or absence would have made no difference to him. He was given to making extraordinary assertions out of a clear sky and evidently believing what he said. My fellow students gave no evidence of connecting what he said with me. Yet, von Treitschke was not a narrow man." And he went on to praise Treitschke as being his best professor. So, it appears that Du Bois believed, given von Treitschke's professional brilliance, his racist outburst should be set aside. It's just not important as compared to the knowledge that he can impart. And I would like to ask Dr. West, do you agree?
Well, I don't agree with the language setting aside. I wouldn't say that the great Du Bois ever set it aside. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
He didn't set it aside. He just said, I've been dealing with these spiritually sick, morally decrepit folk for a long time. I know all the lies that go along with it, but they're also human beings, and they've also done some interesting things that I keep track of. I know what it's like to be excluded from the philosophy club at Harvard, even though the philosophy department is so tied to truth and justice. And thank God for William James, who says, I'm not showing up unless my student Du Bois shows up. And they want William James there. So James and Du Bois are there together. And the other philosophers who are so tied to truth and justice, lying in their practice, white supremacists. This is nothing new for Du Bois. He says, look, I got one life to live. I'm going to come to terms with the deficiencies of these folk. I'm going to see what I can learn from them, and I'm going to be true to the best of the tradition because I don't put my foes as the major point of reference. And if I did, I would be reacting to these motherfuckers every minute of my life, and I never would be able to produce a John Coltrane, Love Supreme.
If students,
You got to fall back on your tradition that already assumes your humanity, gives you a sense of
and
integrity.
if your students came to you to complain about him, what would you tell them? They want to cancel him.
The him is who? Von Treitschke?
Yeah, von Treitschke.
Oh, no, Lord. If we did that, how many professors would you have at that time? Very, very
How about
few.
now?
Now?
Yeah.
In terms of their action and courage and standing up when it comes to oppressed people being crushed, it's not a mass movement among the professoriate to be courageous and speaking the truth, especially when it comes to folk who are being done in.
I meant if a professor said that now at the institution where you speak, and your students want that professor out, what would you say?
Oh, no, I wouldn't try to push him out. Not at
Okay.
all. I would just say that professor needs to stop lying.
May I make 2 points about...
I'm going to get to you
oh.
right now. It'll be the same basic issue, okay? One of the cases I go through closely in the book is the case of Angela Davis. Most of you know her in her woke form, but she was a very impressive young woman, no question about it. She studied at the Sorbonne. She then studied under Adorno in West Germany, and she was teaching Kant already at age 24 in the UCLA philosophy department. Now, I can attest from having struggled with the first 5 pages of the Critique of Pure Reason that that's a very impressive achievement. So, yeah, no problem. She's teaching in the UCLA philosophy department, and there's another professor at UCLA named Arthur Jensen. And Arthur Jensen, in my generation, was very famous for this article in Harvard Educational Review saying black people are genetically inferior to whites in intelligence. And Angela Davis said, when she was asked, that Jensen is an exploiter of academic freedom because he is maintaining that it can be scientifically demonstrated that black people are genetically inferior to white people. He's maintaining that he has the right to talk about things like the genetic inferiority of black men. Now, 2 issues arose. Number 1, whether or not he had the right to teach. But there was a second issue. The second issue was Arthur Jensen was Angela Davis's colleague. And one of the rules of academia, as it's been passed down by the Academic Professional Association, the association, it just slipped my mind, but the AAUP, American Association of University Professors, that you have an obligation to respect the research of your colleagues. Or as they put it, you should show respect for the opinion of others, and you should respect and defend the free inquiry of associates, even when it leads to findings and conclusions that differ from your own. So, here's my question to Nadine. First of all, should a professor who thinks that black people have the IQ of a baboon, should they have the right to teach? And number 2, was Angela Davis morally, or I should say professionally obliged to respect his research?
The devil is in the details. The facts are very important. So you have a right to teach as long as your teaching satisfies the professional standards of your academic peers. That's another really essential aspect of the AAUP standards. When the AAUP essentially formulated the ideals of academic freedom that we still adhere to, they did it back in 1915. They said, look, research should not be, and teaching should not be subject to political power, to corporate power, to economic power, you know, et cetera, but it has to be consistent with the highest standards of your particular discipline. So if the disciplinary consensus is that, you know, his research is flawed or fraudulent, then he doesn't have a right to pursue it. Yes, but as long so
he met the standard.
Then he has the right to publish it. But here goes the details. I would say he does not have a right to teach in a way that carries forward his ideas about racial supremacy into how he treats his students. You may say, well, it's impossible to separate.
Yeah, I think that's crazy.
And I think that's a very important point, but let me tell you about two real cases that we had here in New York during the period that you talk about as political correctness in the 1990s. And as a real coincidence, there were two cases at exactly the same time, and the professors had quite similar names. One was Leonard Jeffries. He was black, and he believed in black racial superiority. He used the term sun people to refer to black people, and I think ice people to refer to whites, and he truly believed, and he wrote a lot and he spoke a lot about how whites were racially inferior. And at the same time, there was another professor, I think they were both in the CUNY system, or the SUNY system, and his name was Jeffrey Levin, and he had the opposite beliefs. He believed quite openly in white racial superiority intellectually, and again, he did a lot of speaking and writing outside of the classroom to espouse his views. There were attempts to fire both of them. The cases went before two different federal courts in New York, and consistent with our standards of free speech, and the evidence was very clear. There was not a single allegation by a single student or anybody else that there had been any discriminatory treatment in the classroom, any discriminatory statement in the classroom, and so the court said you're allowed to continue to teach. But Leonard Jeffries was also the head of his department, and in that capacity he was an official spokesperson for the university, and the court said, well, you may remove him from that position because he's espousing views that are completely inconsistent with the equality views that you're advocating. Now, Norman, I think it's complicated, and I've debated this issue. I'd love to hear what you and Brother West feel about it, because I think now that we've learned something, I know there's debate about it, but there's evidence about implicit racism and unconscious racism, and you say, you know, how can he separate? So there was no evidence then of actual discrimination. But I would respect a student who said, I don't feel, forgive me, comfortable that I'm going to be treated fairly by that professor, and I don't think that the student should have to take the class.
I want to hear Cornel. I just want to, the last question. Was she obliged to respect his research?
If he was according, you know, the standards that were accepted in the profession for research, yes, she has to take those findings very seriously and do her best.
I see Cornel's wife. Cornel's wife is shaking her head. No,
absolutely, that's a dangerous thing. If we're going to rely on the professional consensus, we in a world of trouble. We in a world of trouble. Look how they treated Paul Sweezy, the greatest economist of his generation, LSE, MA, Harvard, PhD at Harvard, student of Joseph Schumpeter, writes the great work of 1942 in the theory of economic development from a Marxist point of view. The consensus in the economics department was neoclassical. no Marxist would ever gain tenure in an economics department. Paul Baran would be the first, and then Rick Wolf and Resnick and others. You see what I mean? So professional consensus is a dangerous thing.
Did she have an obligation to
thing.
respect his research?
No, not at all. If they're telling lies and the arguments are weak and inadequate and inconsistent and driven by a partisanship and an ugly prejudice, not at all. I think we should respect their human dignity.
What does that mean?
Along with their gangster activity. Because human beings do have a certain dignity that's not reducible solely to their gangster activity.
But Cornel, if I may...
This is like Gandhi's letter, Dear Adolf.
No. It's got nothing to do with Mahatmas. Nothing to do with Mahatmas at all.
What you're saying is that they're not honestly applying professional standards. They are not honestly looking at whether it's good economics.
No. What I'm saying is that the professions themselves have been shot through with such limited perspectives and such narrow viewpoints and socialize their students. Look how they treated this brother in terms of the Holocaust industry. How much truth-telling and truth-seeking was actually going on. Now he comes back vindicated, right? He comes back vindicated, and they end up exposed. Ooh, we've been spreading lies all this time. You mean you got your PhD, you got your title, you won all those prizes, and you were spreading lies? Join the club. There's a whole wave of academicians and thinkers who've been doing this since the beginning of time.
How do we correct that?
The AAUP does not say she has to respect his human dignity. They said she has to respect his research, his honest inquiry. He's a professor. Was she obliged to do that?
No, not at all.
But because you're saying it's not honest inquiry.
It just wasn't honest.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It wasn't honest. So I hear what you're saying, Sister Nadine. Now, I'm leaning as far as I can in your direction. It's just that I can't lean that far.
But it seems to me
I don't
that
trust the profession.
again, the devil's in the details,
Yeah.
but I want to reduce to as much as humanly possible the power to make judgments that are not based on the truth seeking that you and Robbie are always aiming for.
That's
and
why I
embodying.
defended both of those brothers at City College. Let them spread their lies. Black supremacy is a lie. White supremacy is a lie. Join the club of mendacity. It's a huge club. And it comes in a lot of different forms. The male supremacy club is huge in the history of the academy. You arrived at Harvard in when? 68? It's been around since 1636. You see what I mean?
They had overt gender-based discrimination when I went. For every one woman that was admitted, it was an official ratio, 4 to 1. There were 4 men. So you had to be much smarter as a woman to get in.
You might not have had a whole lot of competition with the brothers on the Harvard side, because you got a whole history of white male mediocrity like the Kennedys and others going to Harvard. Now there's some others who are quite powerful, quite superb. But let's just be honest about it. Nepotism, mediocrity is shot through these elite institutions, as well as excellence, as well as courage. It's a human thing.
Do you think that students should not be required to take a course from a Leonard Jeffries or a Jeffrey Levin?
That's a wonderful question right there. That's a wonderful question.
So I was asking Brother West, to me, the harder question, that I don't think that they should have been fired, the one with, either black or white supremacy views, but should students be excused, if they so choose, from taking their classes?
I would hope it would be elective, but it is crucial in terms of how do faculty reach agreement in terms of which courses are selective and which courses are not selective. Because in the end, again, I tend to be pretty radically libertarian about this in terms of students being able to critically filter the limitations of their own professors.
I'll just make one brief comment because it has to do with a person in the room who I know. The question of whether somebody with those beliefs, is it really plausible, is it credible, is it believable, that person can separate out his or her beliefs from how he treats a particular student. So I commented in the book that when a white Jewish student walks into an interview or walks into a professor's office hours, he or she starts out with, the professor assumes the person is very smart. And that person has to do something to prove he or she is stupid. Whereas if a minority walks into that professor's office, the assumption is the student is either mediocre or sub-mediocre, and so the student has the burden of now having to prove that he or she is smart. Now, when you have a professor who's starting out boldly, flagrantly, blatantly saying, I think a certain group of people are intellectually inferior, is it really plausible, in your view, is it really plausible that he's going to treat her or him like he would, say, treat a white Asian or white Jewish student? Is that believable? I don't think it's believable.
I mean, I don't either. So that's why I raised the question.
No, it's true.
And I think, you know, it's interesting that in that sense, I think we've learned a lot in the couple of decades since those cases from the 1990s. I don't think they would come out the same way today.
Okay.
But I think a lot of it also has to do with experience. You see, once the very ugly Jewish quotas were shattered, and the cultural Jewish love of language and literacy and learning that's been going on for 2,500 years was able to manifest itself in American culture and the American academy, you were going to have a disproportionate number of Jewish brothers and sisters who end up going to a lot of these schools that are elite institutions. That's just a fact. That's an experience. See, when I showed up from California, chocolate side of Sacramento at Harvard, and I had hardly met a Jewish brother and sister. And I look around and see all these Jewish brothers and say, good God Almighty, what's happening here at Harvard? This is a fascinating experience. Then I showed up with all the left-wing groups, disproportionately Jewish, interesting, fascinating. This is 1960s, things have changed. But not totally. We got Voices for Peace and a whole host of other Jewish brothers and sisters still on the cutting edge. But it was a new experience. And I said, of course. This is a historical and a cultural fair. It ain't got nothing to do with Jewish genes. It ain't got nothing to do with Jewish blood. It has to do with a culture. And in fact, therefore, when somebody has an interview and it's Goldberg rather than McGillicuddy, they say, oh, well, Goldberg must be very sophisticated. No, there's a tradition of Jewish mediocrity too. But we also see Jewish excellence at work. And it has, in fact, been from the Stanley Cavell's and the Sheldon Wohlers and the Noam Chomsky. We can go on and on and on. And each time we mention one of those names, you could also mention a Jewish mediocre figure. But there is a tradition of that we have to be very cognizant of. We can't act as if it's not operative because it is real, and it's a beautiful tradition, actually. We here in Brooklyn, hey, good God Almighty.
I don't want us to be unanimous on such an interesting issue, so I want to quote Cornel's frequent discourse partner, Robbie George, who completely disagrees with what we have just said. And to his credit, he's a devout Christian, and he said that, you know, he had many professors who openly said, if you are a believer, you must be stupid, you must have a low IQ. And he felt that, or even if you're a conservative, which he also is, and that he didn't feel that he should have been excused from their classes. So I can't say it as eloquently as he did, but that's the other side of this argument.
Yes, that part I agree with, but that's for another time. Let me now, there was another issue I wanted to discuss, but I think a lot of people here did come because of their interest in Gaza, and now I want to try to connect the cancel culture, the freedom of speech, with the issue of Gaza. So, I'm going to use the case of Harvard, not because I'm attached to Harvard, but because they've published the most exhaustive reports on the alleged anti-Semitism on college campus, in this case obviously being Harvard. They produced one very large report, one moderately large report. The first on anti-Semitism ran to 350 pages. The one on anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab bias ran to about 220 pages. Now, when you analyze the report, you have to ask yourself 4 questions, in my opinion. Number 1, the incidents that they document. Did the incidents actually occur? It's hard to say because the reports did not look for any corroborative evidence for the incidents. Number 2, let's say an anti-Semitic incident occurred. How pervasive or how representative was it of the encampment and of the atmosphere on campus? Number 3, was the incident anti-Semitic? You could say there was an incident, but is it rightly categorized as anti-Semitic? And number 4, which Nadine already addressed, namely, even if it were anti-Semitic, is it still protected speech? So, bearing those 4 questions in mind, I will give you my impressions. I don't know if Cornel and Nadine have read the reports. Nadine has.
No, I haven't read the report.
Okay. I'll give you my impression. The evidence for anti-Semitism is flimsy to the point of non-existent. There are a couple of tiny incidents which were absolutely representative of nothing. Now, I don't exaggerate. If I say that, it's what I truly believe from having read the reports 3 times to go through the evidence very closely. Now I'm going to take one incident which Nadine cited in an article she co-authored for Time magazine. There was a claim that an Israeli student who approached the encampment in Harvard, he was physically accosted. And Harvard calls this a transparent case of anti-Semitism. And Nadine, in her Time magazine article, affirmed that verdict.
No, I didn't say that it was anti-Semitic because that's not a basis for punishment. I said if the reports are true,
That's
it would
correct.
constitute an assault or a threat.
Okay, so let's look at the incident. The big problem for protesters for a full year was that they were subject not just to doxing, which in my era we called blacklisting. They were subject not just to doxing, but there was a truck that had pictures of the students on the truck with the big words anti-Semite and terrorist. And the truck would every day circle Harvard Square. Now the students complained and complained and complained about that truck and also some websites that were set up which gave personal information about them which could only have been obtained from Harvard administration. On top of that, the trucks went to their family homes, not at Harvard, but hundreds of miles away, and paraded up and down the streets. Now, when this Israeli student approached the encampment, he was filming them. And they were, in my opinion, justifiably nervous that the film was going to go up on the web. Now, you can agree or disagree with them physically accosting him, but that, in my opinion, has, and here I never quarrel with facts. I concede to Nadine, she called it a question of physical assault. But Harvard called it, the report called it a clear-cut case of anti-Semitism. There was nothing zero that can be reckoned as anti-Semitism in that report. And in my opinion, but we could disagree, they had the right to accost him. They had the right. But we can disagree on that. I'm just saying, if that's your evidence of anti-Semitism, if that's your big proof, it's not very compelling. Now, there were things that went on in certain of the divisions of Harvard, the School of Public Health, the Divinity School, which you belong to, in this program called Religion and Public Life, where there was a lot of really cringy political correctness. I have no doubt about that. They had classes in settler colonialism and decolonization and de-Zionizing the Jewish mind. You know, really stupid, cringy, like Robin DiAngelo, she's going to interrupt racism. You know, these idiotic notions. Yeah, it's appalling from an educational point of view, but again, I don't see any anti-Semitism there. So, if what I'm saying is true, then how did they produce a 350-page report documenting anti-Semitism? And it was very revealing how they proved it. They appropriated the whole cancel culture, wokeness vocabulary, and they kept saying over and over again, Jewish students feel uncomfortable. Jewish students feel unwelcome. Jewish students feel unsafe. So just a couple of examples I'm quoting from the report. A pro-Palestinian discourse equating Zionism with racism and likening Israel to Nazi Germany was deeply disturbing to many Jewish students. Regular disruptions, protests, and calls to boycott pro-Israel activities like Birthright Israel presented challenges for students wanting to engage with these programs. Jewish students found Israel Apartheid Week offensive, and they received little sympathy from pro-Palestinian activists. Well, all of that is defensible speech. The problem was that the protesters had been intellectually and ideologically disarmed because they themselves had been using the language of feeling uncomfortable, unsafe, and unwelcome. Now, that's the background, and now we get to the questions. I'm going to ask both of you, and I suspect there's going to be significant disagreement. The two slogans at the demonstrations, which were repeatedly described as making the Jewish students and Israeli students feel unsafe, unwelcome, and uncomfortable, were "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and "Globalize the Intifada." Those were the two slogans. And as all of you know, that issue has re-arisen with Zoran Mamdani and his position on the slogan, "Globalize the Intifada." Now, I'm going to ask two very simple questions, but they're discrete questions, that is, separate questions. Number one, in your opinion, are those slogans anti-Semitic? And number two, which we basically already have the answer to, though Cornel didn't yet weigh in, are they protected speech? So I know from conversation with Nadine, she prefers not to deal with this question, but for reasons which we'll come to, I do believe she has to deal with the question. Do you believe those slogans, "Globalize the Intifada" and "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," do you believe those are anti-Semitic slogans?
Norman, I'll continue to say very stubbornly that I can't generalize. It depends on the intent, it depends on the knowledge, it depends on the context of the particular speaker. So if you're asking me, are those statements inherently based just on the words themselves
Yes.
anti-Semitic? No. I believe that you can make those statements without hating Jews, without discriminating against Jews. Although some people who make those statements may very well be hateful toward and discriminate toward Jews. It all depends.
And
And it is irrelevant
and if
from a
Jewish
legal
students
perspective.
complain that they feel uncomfortable, unsafe, and unwelcome because of those slogans.
I read as you know, I have always opposed, I guess you know, I've always opposed using personal discomfort, subjective discomfort as a justification, certainly for government censorship, which we're now seeing from the Trump administration, but also even for peer pressure and cancel culture. What I found most compelling about the Harvard reports was the concept of discriminatory enforcement. And I think this was why so many people were so upset by the congressional testimony at the end of 2023 by the Harvard president and a couple other presidents, that if the complaints about being uncomfortable or feeling insulted or whatever the terms were had been raised by other minority groups about other expression, there was no protection for that other expression coming from the universities. So there was a double standard about the extent to which they took the complaints from Jewish or Zionist or Israeli students seriously. And I think that none of those complaints should be a basis for speech suppression.
I'm very interested in hearing what Cornel says. And for those of you who it just passed over you, I just want to repeat the point Nadine made. She said during the era of the cancel culture and wokeness, comparable slogans, if they were made against other groups, they would have been dealt with very swiftly. And so the Jewish students were complaining, and Israeli students were complaining there was a double standard. Why weren't these slogans, when they were being shouted, why weren't they dealt with comparable swiftness? I would like to hear, first of all, Dr. West's opinion on the slogans. Second of all, I would like to hear him on whether, in his view, Zoran Mamdani should repudiate the slogan. And number three, because Cornel is a veteran professor at Harvard, in your opinion, was there a double standard? And I'd like you to pause and think about that, because this could get you canceled big time.
When I don't pause, I'm not thinking, brother. That's what you tried. I'm just kidding. No, man. Let's be real about this now. We got to enter this dialogue with a spirit of fallibility and humility. Truth seeking of any kind never renders one comfortable, ever. You got that wonderful line in Melville's Billy Budd, the greatest short story in American literature. What does he say? He says, truth spoken and sought at uncompromisingly has its ragged edges. It cuts at oneself, it cuts at the subject matter, and it cuts at others. Now, he didn't say all of that. I added some of it. But you go see that line in Billy Budd. So I don't believe in safe spaces. Every class I've ever taught, when students come into my class, I said, you are here in order to learn how to die. And you learn how to die by critically examining your assumptions and presuppositions, whatever dogmas and prejudices you have. And when you give some of those up, that's a form of death. And the rebirth, which is education, is to be so disturbed and so uncomfortable that Shakespeare and Dante and Toni Morrison and John Coltrane and Edward Said will so thoroughly disturb you. You'll be so unsafe. That's called getting an education. That's what it is to engage in critical interrogation, not just of somebody else, of oneself. Not just of somebody else's society, but the world in which you live. So when you have a commodified conception of schooling, and the student's a consumer and wants to feel good, and the professor's just to provide the product, then you got a market-driven, commodified conception of education. And of course you're going to talk about safe spaces. Not in our class. No, not in no. We here to de-commodify. Just like the history of black people trying to gangsterize America, and de-niggerize black people who taught to hate themselves and try to reach the courage to express themselves, to be freedom fighters and truth seekers. So that second question about safe spaces, that's gone completely. Now, I fall back on my own experience. I mean, I'm at Union Seminary now for many years in New York, thank God Almighty. But when I was at Harvard, I was the faculty advisor to the gospel choir, Kawumba singers, raising beautiful, joyful noise. You see, magnificent, disproportionately chocolate. We got about 98%. You got a couple of vanilla brothers and sisters in there, and they holding on. You know, they doing their thing. Not always on the beat, but they doing the best they can. But they're always welcome. Always welcome. My dialogue with those students, oh my God, the number of times they had to deal with racist remarks of professors and so forth, on and on and on. No discourse about them at all. At all. I was also faculty advisor to Students for Justice in Palestine. I was blessed to be faculty advisor. We could hardly get a room on campus just to have a dialogue. Veritas, that's the motto of Harvard, truth. And can Harvard hardly find a space for a dialogue? Where is the consistency in terms of a robust, uninhibited conversation in the quest for veritas, in the quest for truth? And when we had those gatherings, every gathering, I'd always step and begin. We are here to be Socratic all the way down.
So
we're raising questions across the board.
Are you denying the double standard argument?
Well, it's not just double standards, but because it's so much hypocrisy, double standards does not embrace it because it's more than just two sides.
You're saying it's more arbitrary.
And this is not just about Jews and Arabs. Yeah. You got black people out here being treated like so-and-sos. You got brown folk being treated like so-and-sos. We got to be able to cast it in a human context in which we're consistent across the board. Now, I'd also say anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Jewish hatred is as sick and evil and wrong as anti-Palestinian hatred. But at the same time, Harvard itself, the center of anti-Semitism, black president, black provost, black dean of the Harvard School, black head of the Harvard board. You think all of those precious, brilliant Jewish brothers and sisters are going to facilitate an institution where anti-Semitism is at its center? No way in God's heaven. One of the reasons why I couldn't get tenure the second time was they're not going to allow for a professor who raises his voice in such a way that he's critical of the consensus when it comes to the dominant narratives and lens vis-a-vis precious Israeli brothers and sisters. They're not going to allow it. And that was true for an Israeli sister who's now at Notre Dame. I won't mention her name. Sister Atali. She got pushed out for the same reason. She was head of the center that we're talking about at Divinity School. She just wrote a recent piece in The Guardian called I Was the Wrong Jew. How come? Because as a Jewish sister, she had the courage and the integrity to engage in a quest for truth-seeking and truth-telling, the same with yourself in terms of this issue, and the same with my dear sister in relation to civil liberties, right? Because it's a human thing. And so in that sense, it's just a joke.
Okay, I want
it's
to
a joke.
I want to just
other than making sure that you protect the dignity of each and every student, Jewish, Arab, brown, yellow, white, whatever, whoever they are.
I just want to clarify.
Okay.
Nadine stated that she found the most compelling argument in the Harvard report that there was a double standard when it came to Jews. That when other groups felt unwelcome, uncomfortable, and unwanted, the university administration reacted swiftly. When it came to after October 7th and the protests began, they didn't act with equal force and swiftness. Do you find that argument convincing?
Oh, I think what I said by implication leads to the conclusion, an undeniable yes. My dear Sister Nadine, I think is telling the truth. Absolutely. I just don't like double standards because I don't like this notion that we're just talking about two groups.
Yeah. And
You got to talk about all the groups and their human dignity being affirmed. So it's not
So
Jews over against the world. It's not Jews and Arabs only.
Okay,
You got
Cornel-
other students there catching hell.
Cornel-
Ain't nobody saying a mumbling word about them.
Cornel, I'm not being coy. It's being recorded. So I want clarity on your view. Do you believe that in the interests of consistency, Harvard should have come down as hard on the Jewish students, as hard on the protesters as it did during the era of political correctness on other groups who were behaving in fashions that caused some people to feel unwelcome, uncomfortable? Do you believe
that isn't what I advocated,
No, but that's not what
Norman.
Sister Nadine, because now you're talking about
I'm
repression.
talking
Now you're
about
talking about
leveling
repression.
up.
Come down hard. That's not my language now. I want more consistency, but that's different than come down hard.
I mean, you can, for consistency, you can either, level up the suppression, suppress more speech, or you can level up the free speech, less suppression.
See, I'm with Sister Nadine on that. But if you want me to look in this camera and say, for the record, has there been a certain preferential treatment of Jewish brothers at Harvard? Sisters too, absolutely. But at the same time, there's no such thing as a Jewish community that's monolithic or homogeneous, because you got so many Jewish folk who were part of those encampments, so many Jewish voices that were raising their voices with tremendous courage and integrity, and they acted as if they don't count. They are as much, have the same dignity as the Jewish conservatives and the Jewish liberals and the Jewish centrists, who must be respected in terms of human beings, who must not be mistreated, but at the same time, they have received privileged status, and that's wrong. Is that clear enough in there?
Well, human reality is complicated. You said two things. They're not contradictory. They seem, but they're not. They seem to be in conflict. On the one hand, you're saying that a double standard was applied against the Jewish students. On the other hand, you said a large number of the Jewish students have a privileged status at Harvard. That's also part of the reality. Am I correct?
Let me put it this way, that when you have...
Watch him backtrack.
Right, no way. When you have a neo-fascist regime in Washington that's trying to weaponize anti-Jewish hatred with very little interest in the well-being of concrete Jews, and bringing that kind of pressure to bear, and Harvard having to respond, they do end up privileging the protection of Jewish students when other students themselves ought to receive the same exact consistent kind of protection. And when you talk about protection of Jewish students, you're primarily talking about those Jewish students who were unsafe when folk were trying to raise their voices in one of the most vicious forms of the crimes of humanity taking place in the last few years. And I think they ought to be applauded. And in every protest, every encampment, of course you're going to get xenophobia. You got to call it into question. Of course you're going to get limited formulation. You criticize it. But the fact that you have a younger generation that's willing to straighten its back up and shatter some of the lies and crimes that have been committed and hidden by their parents and their grandparents, that's a beautiful thing. That's one of the signs of hope for a species that's so wretched and so tied to greed and hatred and cowardliness, not just in America, but in the history of the species since we emerged from the caves.
Since you asked legal questions earlier, I want to be very clear that the Trump administration's invocation of Title VI of the
That's what I was just going to ask you.
Oh, okay, of the 1964
I wanna,
Civil Rights Act. I mean, it's very important law. And by the way, today is also the anniversary of the death of John Lewis, the great civil rights leader,
God, I missed that.
who, in fact, there were protests all over the country, including, I believe, some here in Brooklyn, No King's Day, together with Let's Make More Good Trouble, in the tradition of John Lewis.
the question I was just going to ask Nadine is, the spokespersons for the Jewish students also claimed that these demonstrations, because they made students feel unwelcome, unsafe, and uncomfortable, these demonstrations also violated Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it's useful, information if Nadine can explain what is Title VI and was that argument valid that the encampments and the demonstrations violated Title VI.
Title VI, before I say what Title VI is, let me say that just as you said that the progenitor of exaggerated concerns about anti-Semitic expression goes back to woke, political correctness in the 1990s and at the behest of the left in many situations. We see something similar now with Title VI because the distorted way that the Trump administration is using it to punish what should be constitutionally protected expression, including protest expression, is building on the legacy that began under Obama, was continued under Biden, of weaponizing Title IX, another civil rights statute that prohibits gender-based discrimination, but it was used and is still being used, frankly, to suppress any expression about gender or sexuality that makes somebody uncomfortable. The statutes themselves only require non-discrimination in terms of conduct. But there is one concept that has entered into the distorted interpretation of both statutes, and that is an overly broad concept of what's often called hostile environment harassment. And that was a concept that pervaded the anti-Semitism reports, but we've also seen it in all, Title IX cases. And the allegation is essentially that if there is enough discriminatory or hateful or anti-Semitic or sexist expression, you add it all together, that creates a hostile environment and that undermines the equal educational opportunity. However, that is legally incorrect. Way back in 1999, the United States Supreme Court issued an appropriately narrow definition of hostile environment harassment. And it's been ignored ever since, but I think it behooves all of us who want to protect the rights of protesters, who want to protect freedom of robust discourse on all of these important and controversial topics, to adhere to this definition, which is that the discriminatory conduct, which may include expressive conduct, such as demonstrations and protests, has to be not only subjectively offensive, that it makes one person feel uncomfortable, that's not enough. It also has to be objectively offensive, and it has to be so severe and so pervasive that it effectively denies an equal educational opportunity. A deliberately, and I would say appropriately, difficult standard to meet through expression. And what's more, even if you can show that all of those criteria are satisfied, the university doesn't have an obligation to suppress speech. To the contrary, the regulations say that speech has to be protected. The university has to take some reasonable step, and that's not defined because the legislation recognizes that it has to defer to the educational expertise and discretion of the university faculty and administration. So as long as it takes some reasonable step, which could include, expressing its own opposition to discrimination, providing some kind of counseling and support, mental health services for students who feel that they're traumatized by the expression. The university can be punished for violating Title VI only if it is deliberately indifferent to the hostile educational environment. So, from the evidence that I've seen, I've read the Harvard report, I've read the Columbia report, there are, students are suffering, and I don't want them to suffer, and none of us does, and we want them to have resources. But that does not justify government punishment. It is not a violation of the statute, and the fact that the statute is being used to suppress constitutionally protected speech means that not only are the statutory criteria being ignored and violated, but the U.S. Constitution, which is supreme over any statute, is also being violated and ignored.
Well, I thought personally that's very useful. I didn't know all of that, and that's useful. I want to go on to a related...
I didn't say anything about the slogans, though, brother.
Oh, you didn't?
I
got two.
You were about to skip me, though, brother. You got to be jazz-like and come back with this improvisational sensibility.
I got entranced.
No, I'm just kidding.
Transfixed by your response. So.
No, but I think Sister Nadine said it. Any set of slogans are polyvalent, which means they're subject to multiple interpretations. You see. And so any set of slogans at any rally that we have comes out of very deep places, deep hurt, visceral at the most profound level. So we're not going to get the most sophisticated, nuanced slogan that is not subject to a variety of different interpretations. You see, from the river to the sea can mean there ought to be one secular state in which there's equal rights for persons across the board, whatever religious, ethnic group, and so forth. That's not annihilating Jews. That's not calling for the killing of Jews at all. But can it be interpreted to mean the annihilation of Jews? Of course it can be interpreted in that way. Yes, indeed. Very much so. But from the river to the sea, that's what I'm seeing going on right now on the ground. With the claims about greater Israel. With the claims about annihilating precious Palestinian brothers and sisters, ethnic cleansing of Palestinian brothers and sisters. So on the one hand, you got all these folk concerned about the slogan. On the ground, precious human beings and babies getting crushed, and the colossal failure of the professional managerial class in the United States. Doing away with all the hospitals. Where's the American doctors raising their voices? Done away with all the universities. Where's the university presidents and professors raising their voices? Doing away with all the schools. Doing away with all of the community centers. Doing away with all the mosques. Where's the religious voices bringing critique to bear? Hardly a mumbling word. That's where you know that something deeply is hypocritical. Spiritually bankrupt, morally vacuous. And I say that not out of hatred. I say that out of a hatred of the domination and out of the love of those 20,000 Palestinian children who are no longer able to breathe a breath. That's what we're talking about. That's the moral force. That's the ethical force what we ought to be focused on, but it's a distraction from that. And we end up talking about, well, the students were feeling unsafe and they were feeling so offended because of these slogans. Hey, get off the crack pipe. Nothing but a distraction from the suffering that's taking place.
We're going to get to that, I promise you.
Absolutely. But I'm glad you gave me a chance to say something about that.
I would be curious, because you did run for president this past year. as a tactical question, do you think Zohar Mamdani should repudiate the Globalize, the Intifada slogan?
Well, I think it's up to my brother, though. You know, I have great respect for the brother. He's got tremendous intelligence and courage and unbelievable consistency, and his mama and daddy are two magnificent persons. I don't know them, but I could just tell by the product. But if he does repudiate it, it means that his integrity will be lessened. There's a difference between being prudent and being opportunistic. And one of the problems of our political class, especially in the two decrepit political parties that we have, the neo-fascist Republicans and the milquetoast, less than mediocre Democrats, is that you don't have any will stand on principle. They'll say and do anything to win. Anything. Back to Melville again. The Melville has a notion in Billy Budd called virtuous expediency. So he views a certain kind of expediency as a species of virtue, not just opportunism. And that's a fascinating formulation, because every politician, every professional manager in certain contexts with structural constraints has to combine expediency on the one hand with integrity, honesty, decency, and moral consistency on the other. How do you walk that tightrope? We're going to see what our dear brother Soran. Okay. But I think it's a beautiful thing of what he's doing. I just put that on the record too. We've already said it many times on my social media. But he's tied to a decrepit Democratic Party, so I'm praying for him.
I think the world of Nadine. I know that's usually the beginning of Here Comes Trouble, but I do. And in the course of our correspondence, she sent me a recent article she wrote, to which I've already alluded. And I have to say, I came to a point where my heart dropped, and I wondered whether, if I brought it up, it's going to create a chasm, an unbridgeable chasm between us. It more than irritated me. For those of you who remember, the troubles in the college campuses did not begin under Trump. There's this optical illusion now being foisted by the liberal media that the troubles began under Trump. That's just factually untrue. The troubles in the college campuses began when a coterie of Jewish billionaires started to threaten the universities that they were going to withdraw alumni contributions if the encampments weren't crushed. Now, as Nadine knows because she read the Harvard report, one alumni had given Harvard $200 million. A second alumni had given Harvard $300 million. That assault on academic freedom began with Bill Ackman, who demanded Claudine Gay's head, the president of Harvard at the time. By the time the assault was over, and it was not over, the first phase was over, it was all triggered by that billionaire class, and by the end, the presidents of not one, not two, but 3 Ivy League universities were toppled. Claudine Gay, McGill at U of P, and Shafiq at Columbia. To me, that was just the most outrageous, egregious breach of academic freedom, and I know we're going to disagree about that, of academic freedom in our country's history, beginning with the beginning of the 20th century, when the first assaults began on academic freedom, and it was mostly the billionaire class of that era who led the assaults. Until the present, there's never been something like what happened in the spring of 2024. It's unprecedented. Now, I read Nadine's co-authored article, and she wrote, donors may justifiably choose to no longer fund institutions whose responses to anti-Semitism do not reflect donors' values or goals. Now, another consequence, Bill Ackman, the billionaire, he then said he's going to make sure that anybody in those encampments or involved in those protests will never get a job once they graduate. And law firms then start to affirm that. Now, I recognize as a constitutional matter, they have the right. They're donors. They can withdraw their money. But as a factual matter, that's just the most grotesque assault on academic freedom in our country's history. They were holding the universities hostage. They were engaged in extortion against the universities. And I cannot see how you cannot condemn that without detail, categorically. You, Bill Ackman, do not have the right to decide who is going to be president of Harvard University. You do not have that right. You may have billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, but you do not have that right, nor do you have the right to give a mayoral candidate, as he's now threatening to do, hundreds of millions of dollars to unseat or prevent Zoran Mamdani from becoming mayor of New York. Now, technically, he may have that right, but by any moral reckoning or standard, that is unacceptable, period, full stop, and these folks need to be stopped.
I hate to disappoint you, Norman, but I agree with everything you said, with one exception. I tend to be very humble and about making, absolute statements. So when you say this is the worst violation of academic freedom, I'm not sure I'm ready to say that without having studied the history of McCarthyism or going back to the beginning when the AAUP was founded. But I completely agree with you. And as I said earlier, the initial impetus for the founding of the AAUP, the issuing of the first Declaration of Academic Freedom Principles, was precisely the problem of the economic titans of the era who were dominating the boards of trustees, and alumni just casually throwing their weight around. If they didn't want a professor teaching because the professor's views were inconsistent with their financial interests. There was a famous case from Stanford, there was another one at Columbia, and I do agree, he does, and the reason I use the word justified, and you have to, it may have been a clumsy wording, is that he doesn't have a legal obligation to give any money to any of these universities, and he can decide for whatever reason that he doesn't want to finance what is going on at those universities. In that sense, it's justified, but it is definitely a huge impediment to academic freedom.
And I think the real crucial point to keep in mind is there has never been a golden age in the history of the American university. It has always had these kinds of dynamics in place. When Lionel Trilling wrote his dissertation on Matthew Arnold in the 1930s and was told, we will never have a Jew teach English poetry, and he shifted to University of Wisconsin. How come? Because the WASPs were in control then, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant big money. And they said, we're not going to give money to have this Jewish person teaching on Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley. I don't know whether they got Swinburne in or not, but this is a long history. They said the same thing when they allowed women in. This is the end of Western civilization. You're not going to receive another penny from us. Really? Some of them held off. Some of them didn't. And you can imagine what they said when Jamal and Letitia and Ray Ray and Baybra and Cornel West and others came in as proud, self-determining black people. This is the end of Western civilization as we know it. You'll never get another penny from us. The lesson is, it's such a human thing, because certain groups that were excluded then now have more power, and they fall into the same immoral trap. And we would see it again. What will the immigrants from India and Africa and the Caribbean be like 50 years from now, when they begin to flower and flourish and more have significant power, where they become so thoroughly commodified and Americanized that they'll be just as truncated and morally constipated as so many of the elites right now, and so many of the elites were then? That, to me, is also a crucial question. So let us not think that somehow there was just some golden age, and then now we've got this major decline. No. This struggle is consistent. The greed, the hatred, the indifference, the callousness, it is always something that's in place, hegemonic, to be radically critiqued, called into question, organized, mobilized against it, and be ready to live and be ready to die with a smile and with style, just like John Coltrane did 58 years ago. A smile, style, and a sound with so much dignity that people still are addicted to it in the best sense, because he held on to his humanity in a moment of overwhelming inhumanity.
Ancient Greece was hardly think of Socrates, right?
That's right. Think of Jeremiah and Esther, and we ain't got to Jesus yet, but we don't want to go there right now because I got too much to say about Jesus.
I want to ask one last question, and then hopefully if there's time we can take questions from the audience. The Harvard report had a very curious definition of anti-Semitism, and I'd like to read it to you. We define anti-Semitism as an identity-based bias that has kept the Jewish Harvard affiliates from fully participating in Harvard's educational, co-curricular, and social life. Similarly, we define anti-Israel bias as an identity-based bias that has kept Harvard affiliates with Israeli nationality or background from fully participating in Harvard's educational, co-curricular, or social life, which basically means if Jews or Israelis feel left out, then it's a form of anti-Semitism. And a large part of the report is devoted to this phenomenon they call shunning. You okay?
Oh, yeah.
A phenomenon they call shunning. And they say that the Israeli and Jewish students felt shunned. They felt ostracized. So to give a couple of examples, I'm quoting, Israeli students reported feeling particularly targeted and ostracized, frequently experiencing social shunning. Accounts of social shunning emerged as one of the most alarming indicators of the breakdown of Harvard's on-campus community. Some Jewish students expressed sadness and frustration at feeling shunned, and so forth. Now, I say this question for last because I am concerned about the reaction. So I'm going to just give some context, and then we can go to the reaction. So if you look at the public opinion polls in Israel, Israel is probably the most polled place on God's earth. If you look at the public opinion polls, about 1/2 of Israeli Jews believe that Israel, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, should commit genocide in Gaza. That's not an exaggeration. The question that was put to Israelis was very concrete and succinct. When the IDF enters a city, should it kill every single person in the city? 47% of Israeli Jews said yes to that question. Another question was, do you believe there are any innocents in Gaza? Any innocents? It was asked of Israelis across the board, including non-Jewish Israelis. 62% said there are no innocents in Gaza. If you factor away the non-Jewish respondents, it would come to about 70%. If you turn to Gaza now, Israel, for better or for worse, it has a citizen army. That means that army is representative of Israeli society. That army is carrying out a genocide. Every member of that army, EVERY, every member of that army is complicit in genocide. If it's not, as doctors have attested, if it's not targeting the skulls and chests of children, if it's not bombing the hospitals, bombing the schools, bombing any infrastructure in Gaza, the water and sanitation facilities, then they're involved in the systematic, methodical starvation, verging on famine of the people of Gaza. Now, when students, or I should say, when IDF soldiers come after their stint in the army to Harvard campus, or there are Jews who are publicly defending a real-time genocide broadcast across the social media to the point that even I, who professionally ought to be following it, I have stopped reading it. One nauseating story after another, one sickening story of genocidal murderers in plain sight. Now, I heard one or both of you say, of course, everyone should feel at home at Harvard. I say no. They should be shunned. They should be ostracized. If they're there, I suppose they have a right to be there. But this notion that we need, and Nadine will confirm, I suppose for me, the bulk of the report's recommendations are we must be inclusive. We must be pluralistic. We must embrace everyone. And I know Brother West. He embraces everybody. When he says Brother Sharpton, I cringe. But He does it, even though Brother Sharpton has stabbed him many a time in the back.
Oh, yeah.
But I say they ought to be shunned. You ought not to be inclusive of child killers. You lose me there. Nadine.
When I was invited to participate in this event, I said I'm not going to debate the policies in Gaza. I'm only here, so I'm not agreeing with what you say, Norman, but I'm not here to debate that. I'm here to address the very important free speech issues, which freedom of speech belongs to everybody, including those whose views I deeply oppose on the particular issues. And just as Bill Ackman has the right to shun Harvard by withdrawing his money, any member of the campus community has a right to shun any other member of the campus community, but I strongly advocate that they not do it for reasons that go back to that first question that I thought was going to be our last question, because we kept going around and around and around. I think that even a war criminal should be admitted to campus for purposes of truth-seeking, for purposes of trying to prevent genocide in the future. And I don't believe that the effective way to do it is to shun, shame, or ostracize. Now, I'd like to quote, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the works of Loretta Ross. She's this amazing, wonderful, black feminist who has, I met her many, many, many years ago when we were both crusading against domestic violence and sexual violence and for reproductive justice. And this is somebody who feels so strongly that the only way that we can effectively prevent these tragedies and these catastrophes is try to engage with those people who have been perpetrators. And she actually goes into prisons and deals with convicted rapists, including convicted child rapists, to reach out to them to try to be redemptive. She's probably a Christian, Norman. So, you know, again, you can condemn something that somebody has done in the past. I'm not saying I agree with your condemnation, but assuming somebody has done something that is contemptible, I look at a university in particular as a place of education where we try to surmount the limitations and the transgressions that have marked and marred our lives in the past, and use education and persuasion and humanity and love and compassion and empathy in the hope of reducing those problems and transgressions in the future.
Now, I know Anita, Cornel West's wife in the first row, is looking at Cornel and wondering what he's going to say now. And if he says the wrong thing, there may be trouble at home tonight. I'm serious, Cornel, because you know, you can make jokes about it, and you can make levity,
not making jokes at all,
but
brother.
it's not a, as they used to call it, it's not a invention, it's not a mind game.
That's right.
I'm asking you, Cornel, do you feel that those students are obliged to be inclusive of child killers? I'm curious, because I know you're very inclusive. Maybe your tent stretches from here to the other side of the galaxy. Do you believe that they should be inclusive of child killers?
Yeah,
cameras are homing in.
that's a hell of a way of characterizing it, though, because you see, part of the problem here, brother, is that, I mean, the history of religions, which has been, for the most part, the history of barbarism in terms of institutional religions, they have specialized in shunning people. And once you begin to shun, then the next step is dehumanization, subjugation, and you're just redoing the same cycle that you yourself were resisting from the very beginning. On the other hand, and here this is where, now see, and he did not, we have such great respect and love for you, brother, but we don't agree on everything. Is that right, though, babe? We don't agree on everything. Because different strokes for different strokes, not in the superficial sense. Sly Stone just died. That ain't no joke. That was at the dignity of everyday people. You a different kind of brother than I am. I don't have to make you like me. You the kind of brother who have courage, intellect, unbelievable commitment to truth, and believes in shunning. I'm a different kind of brother. Shunning people who are connected with killing babies.
I don't believe in shunning as if it were a
It's
political
connected to-
principle. It's a visceral reaction.
Yes.
There's something revolting about being, as Harvard kept writing, to be inclusive of child killers. I find that just an utterly revolting concept,
but
isn't it?
but we just different kind of brothers.
You-
Man. We
all
got
right,
different kind of
fine.
temperaments, man.
I'm
I don't
gonna ask
believe
you-
in just.
look, Cornel,
Look at it this
I'm
way.
gonna ask
Look at
you-
it
no,
this
Cornel,
way.
would you corrupt?
If we shunned
One second.
every American who supported the extermination of indigenous peoples, there's not a whole lot of folk left in the
Okay,
history
Cornel,
of the television.
fine.
If we shun
No, but we
the
can do-
majority of Americans who
No,
supported the
this-
enslavement of
this
black
is-
people, the lynching of black
this
people,
is a-
Jim Crow and Drain Crow, who's left? Well, you got
Yeah.
some Mormons, you got some Quakers and some Mennonites and so forth around. Then you got the secular Jews in Brooklyn
I'm
who
sorry.
come in with this
This
rich
is-
tradition and want to go to the back of the bus on the Jim Crow bus when all the black
Yeah,
folk are
this
there
is-
and the Goyim is
okay.
in the front. That's a small group.
No, this is a rhetorical evasion.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
I'm speaking
Cornel,
directly
Cornel,
to your question. I'm
would you-
just not agreeing
would
with
you cavort and carouse? Because these students are complaining. They don't invite us to their parties. That's what they say. They don't invite us to our parties. They don't want us in our groups. They don't want to associate with us.
That's microsocial activity,
Would
though,
you
brother.
cavort?
We know that's not
Yeah,
the
but that's-
issue.
the
That's not the
report-
crucial issue.
No,
the question
report-
is, how do you stop the killing of Palestinian children
Yeah,
and
but-
innocent folks?
fine,
And how do you
I'm
become
all-
organized and mobilized enough to
No.
bring power and pressure to bear? It's not whether they get invited to some party after somebody's
Yep.
Hillel meeting and so forth and so on. No, we're not going to spend time on that.
Would you cavort and carouse with a child killer? I'm curious. I don't think that's a trivial question.
No.
You wouldn't.
No.
You
If I knew
you would shun them, correct?
I would do more than shun, brother. I'd probably cuss them out and lose my Holy Ghost and kick their behind in the name of Jesus. But the point is, that's not normative. That's not the only model that I want everybody to proceed. I got my own way of being in the world. I'm a jazz man, got my own voice. This is how I decide to live my life. I want to love my way through the darkness. I don't believe in shunning, even given the crimes that people commit. If you got a different view, that's cool. I'm with you. We in the same demonstrations. We go to jail together, and we have fascinating conversations on child killers and how do you respond to child killers. That's all. Is that direct?
I'm not sure.
Oh, you're not sure? Oh, I see. I see. Lord. Nadine, well, oh, you say you don't want to comment on this, though, huh? This exchange right here.
Oh, well, I'm with you. I thought that was clear from what I already said. I think that, and I thought, in most contexts, Norman is against canceling, is
Totally,
against shunning.
totally.
Yeah,
That's
so
true.
you have a war crimes exception to all
Absolutely.
of your free
Yes.
speech.
I do.
No, but
I said that 2 hours ago.
no,
I
that's
have
true.
a war
You're
crime
right. You're absolutely
because-
right. You're right. And
because
it's understandable. It's just not justifiable.
I've told this story many times, and people will forgive me for repeating myself. So in 1979, My mother was testified in a trial in Düsseldorf, West Germany, as it was called back then, for the guards from Majdanek concentration camp. And my mother was astonished. They were allowed to freely walk in the courtroom. She assumed when she was invited that they would be in some way incarcerated, but they just moved around freely. And she knew the guards. She knew the guards. And then one night, as we were walking out of the courthouse, after she gave her testimony, who should be walking right to my right? Well, my mother was to my left. The person who was reputedly the most murderous of the guards. She went by the name of Birgitta. And she walked, I didn't know what to do. She was hugging my shoulder like Nadine here, the guard, and Cornel here. I didn't know what to do. And she walked around 100 feet down, and I turned to my mother and I said, "Do you know who that is?" My mother squinted, and then her eyes like a doe in the headlights. "Birgitta?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said to her, "What do you want me to do?" And she raised her finger. She said, "Get her! Get her! Get her! They think we're sheep! Get her!" And now you're talking to me about being inclusive? Being pluralistic? Having a jazz sensibility? It doesn't register for me. It's not real life. It's not real human beings. It's not immoral, it's amoral. It's like human beings who, in the course of intellectual discourse or abstract principle, lose sight of what's happening. 2,000 families, and as you know, Gazan families are very big. 2,000 families, 2,200, have been wiped out, every member of the family. 5,000 families, only one person survived. And then these people come to Harvard after doing their stint in the army, and they complain they're being shunned. Shunned? You're lucky you're not shot. My mother said, "Get her, get her." And my mother wanted me to kill her. No question in my mind about that. At that moment, she wanted me to kill her. So it doesn't compute.
But the question
it
is this, though, brother. That's very
me.
powerful. It's very powerful. But the question is this. We go back to my grandfather. Head of the deacon board. Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. Killed his brother.
Say that again?
His brother's lynched.
Yeah,
He got his shotgun. So the question for you is, what did you do? Did you hunt the cat down and beat him down the way your mother wanted you to? Or did you just keep on walking? Because granddad got his gun and went looking for the mother hucker, and if it wasn't for the rest of the deacon board, he was going to kill him. Now, he may not have killed him in the name of Jesus. He would have said, "My Holy Ghost is gone. I got to be on a visceral level. This is going to be eye for an eye." But he did something. He didn't just talk about it. He wasn't a spectator and an observer. He followed through. And when he came to his senses, in a certain sense, he said, "I'm glad the deacon board did come back, and they took my gun from me, but I was going to kill him." So if my mother was walking with me down the street, and I saw the mother hucker who would do that, I'm like my grandfather. I want to throw down. I want some kind of accountability. Now, I don't believe revenge is the same thing as justice, but I want some accountability. So I'm asking you, what did you do?
I've never told.
But the person's still living, right?
No comment.
Okay.
You know,
Lord, we better pass some water and some cognac up here. Jesus Christ.
And I'll be,
Lord have mercy.
I'll be humble enough to say I have no idea what I would do in that circumstance.
But it's a human thing, the way
what I aspire to do is I channel, again, another one of my heroes, Brian Stevenson, great crusader against the death penalty, advocate for people who have committed murderous acts. And among other things, he says, you know, we are not the worst thing that we've ever done. I believe in the possibility of redemption for everybody, and I hope that I would honor that.
Okay, the floor is now yours.
I'm so sorry, but I was told this would end at 9. I have a 2.5-hour trip. So it's been such an honor to engage with all of you. I'm so sorry to miss, I think it's 9:40.
Is it 9:40? We've been going that
long.
So
sorry to miss the audience. Thank you all very much.
Wow, good God Almighty. Good to see you, my dear sister. You drive safe. Drive safe. So we've gone 40 minutes.
I want to just affirm, I do believe Nadine is a very special person. She did things for me on a personal level which nobody else ever has, and I want to acknowledge that. And I was concerned that this might end on an unfortunate note, and I want to just say publicly, I hope our friendship will endure.
I think you're in good shape, though. She had a smile on her face, she had joy in her soul, but she had some disagreements too, but that's all right. We're supposed to disagree. We're going to come up here and not disagree in that way. But somebody's still wrong about this thing.
Anyone want to ask a question? You're all welcome. Yes. Do you think you can stand up, or can you pass the microphone?
Oh. There you go, my dear brother.
Yeah, it's a simple question. Many of the people who feel uncomfortable or say they feel uncomfortable are in some ways expressing Israeli state policy to intentionally confuse anti-Zionist Israel comments against the Zionism of Israel with being anti-Jewish. They're on campus, they intentionally, dishonestly, bad faith actors.
Totally agree.
And I think that's what a good deal of this whole propagandistic direction is, in sense, a Israeli government activity that's gone on much before the last few years. I remember, I think I considered inviting you to a conference 20 years ago in Princeton, a civic organization, United Nations Association, and before I knew anything about you, I was told that, no, you don't want to invite that guy because he's a self-hating Jew. And, I had no idea your reputation. When I investigated, this became something I've heard over and over again, especially with activists, Jewish activists. They would say, well, if you talk to somebody else, they're going to say I'm a self-loathing Jew. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if the IDF guy who's a graduate student at Columbia is guilty of many of the atrocities that have befallen the Palestinians, Dr. West, why shouldn't he be, quote unquote, shunned? I wouldn't necessarily use that word, but why wouldn't he not necessarily be excluded from civilized activities?
No, I appreciate those words, though, brother. I think the problem with me, my dear brother, is that there's power in what you and Brother Norman are saying. But once you open that door and you recognize, you see, Palestinians are not the only people in the history of the modern world that's been trashed and terrorized and killed and murdered and maimed. That's much of the history. You see, Congo, Haiti, we can go on and on and on and on. Dalit peoples in India, Muslims in China, it goes on and on and on and on. So once you open that door, how are we ever going to organize and mobilize? How are we ever going to generate forms of solidarity to try to change it? We're going to be spending so much time reacting to the gangster activity in the form of shunning. All that energy for shunning, it could be channeled in another way for organizing. It could be electoral politics with our dear brother Soran and so forth. And he's no Messiah, but he's a good brother. He's a force for good. Right, that's true. Because I believe, again, that really is your choice. That really is your choice. My own experience in the movement has been that there are always comrades, like Brother Norman and others, who disagree with me on this issue and will always be there. Because as I said before, there is a variety of voices in any resistance movement. And there's got to be internal critique in those resistance movements for me. So when you say, well, why wouldn't we shunning? Well, there's going to be a group that will do it anyway. But I will still be critical because I just see it opening the door and sliding down a slippery slope to the kind of ideologically promiscuous view in which in the end everybody end up, large numbers of people end up getting shunned. And the next thing you know, it's like any other movement. People turn on each other, the fratricide, the various attacks on each other and so forth and so on. But I do hear what you're saying though, brother, and I don't want to give the impression that I'm not taking seriously, not just felt intellectually, but felt in terms of my heart of the power, the moral and the spiritual power of what my brother's talking about, and what you, my brother, talking about too. I'm just still not convinced. I'm just still not convinced. I got a different way of being in the world. I've decided to do that, and I'm going to be true until the day I die. That's just who I am.
Anyone else? I think she's going to bring the microphone. Thank you.
Good evening, Brother West. Utmost respect to you, but I just want to, by extension, do we not BDS, do we not boycott? Because by extending that train of thought, do we not engage in boycott?
Oh, no. Boycott's crucial.
But isn't it an extension of...
Shunning. Isn't boycotts an extension
of
of shunning?
Yes, but see, the boycott is a collective effort that's responding to the voices of an oppressed people who are believing that this is the best way of bringing some kind of visibility to the barbarity of the present. That's why I support BDS for many, 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 many years. Because when I listen to the voices of my precious Palestinian brothers and sisters, and Brother Omar and others, this is, for us, the best way of sustaining the kind of resistance and doing exactly what we did in the 1980s. And many of us are old enough to remember the 1980s with South Africa, old enough to remember El Salvador, the boycotts and the sanctions and the attempt to divest. So that's a collective effort of resistance and a certain kind of insurgency that I thoroughly support. But these two brothers here we're talking about at the individual level and how individuals respond to that. And I just think there's going to be a variety of ways, and we have our own internal disagreements about that. Is that you get at your point though, brother? Yeah, no, I appreciate it. But you can see, yeah, no, the tension is there now. We're never going to do away with the tension. We human beings. We got to live in the tensions rather than try to flatten them out, because they never flattened out. But the tensions can become destructive, or they can become creative. That's where the jazz comes in. When it's creative, it's jazz. When it's destruction, it's just a murder of silence. It's not music.
Anyone else would like to ask a question? Yeah.
Yes, up here. Hi. First of all, both of you, thank you so much. And Norm, to you specifically, yeah, thank you for your work, especially since October 2023. You've been really, yeah, I don't know what the right word is, but what comes to mind is an anchor for me, especially how you answered repeatedly to the question of, like, do you condemn Hamas? And I feel like the reference that you made there, especially to like Nat Turner, and that also being, I feel like, a style of yours in this time, that you draw comparisons that I find really valuable. So I really thank you for that. Coming to the end of this discussion right here, I can't help, and this ties into this book of yours, which I actually just finished reading today. This book that everybody here is getting tonight, and I read all the footnotes, and and I have my qualms with it. And to this last point, how you ask the question to both of the people on stage here, and specifically to Cornel, I feel I can't help but kind of see a parallel to how I've seen you in the last 2 years, especially when you were invited by, let's say, very much pro-Israel people who were just like fighting you and who repeatedly asked this condemning Hamas question. And whenever you went into drawing comparisons to Nat Turner, people getting upset about that comparison, people accusing you of evading the question and not really replying to it, I can't help but kind of be reminded of that, but kind of like the other way around. And that brings me to my question that I initially wanted to ask you here. Like, I know that this is the second edition of this book. I haven't read the first edition. To my understanding, the only difference really is the appendix. So not knowing the first edition, only knowing the second edition, and knowing quite a few interviews you gave at the time that you first published, or the first edition was published, I find myself coming back to two conversations that you had. One was with Professor Jared Ball, who I think you also spoke to repeatedly.
Jared Ball was...
Jared Ball.
Oh, Jared Ball, yes.
Yes.
Jared Ball.
And number two, on invitation of Katie Halper, with Barbara Smith from the Combahee River Collective and Robin D.J. Kelly. Mm-hmm. And I've found that in both of these interviews, the people I just mentioned, they really like probed you on your stance in the book, and I feel like made good points, and I feel like only in the stance of the conversation with Barbara Smith, you, in the conversation itself, said to Barbara, like, I thank you for this conversation, and it serves as a corrective. Now, this is before the publication of the second edition now, and my question is, like, what kind of corrective are we talking about? Because you haven't really elaborated on that, at least in that conversation, like what you meant by that. And I don't really see, I mean, what I was pleased to hear tonight, like you refrained from referring to identity politics explicitly, but I still find it in this book mentioned. So yeah, I could go on and on about this, but I think my pointing question to you is what was the corrective that Barbara Smith and Robin D.G. Kelly, like, what was their corrective in your way of thinking about this? Yeah, period. Thank you.
I'll speak frankly. That was about, that would be about 3 or 4 years ago, and I don't now recall the exact substance of the conversation. I would have to, there are technicalities. There was no way first of all, I had no time to rewrite the book because I was so steeped in Gaza. I just needed a new publisher for reasons which I don't care to go into. But I wanted to add something on this whole affirmative action issue, which came up with the Supreme Court decision. In general, I have no respect at all for the cancel culture or the identity politics. There are many reasons why, which I elaborate across 600 pages in that book, But there's also a very personal side to it. I recently sent to Cornell a tribute to Paul Robeson, who was a childhood hero of mine, and will go to my death as my hero. And it was written by CLR James, who was a famous black historian and a Trotskyist in an era where Paul Robeson was clearly identified as a Stalinist. And they were both towering figures. And I was really trembling because I respect them both, but Robeson more by a wide margin. I was trembling at whether CLR James was going to wipe the floor with Robeson. I didn't know what was going to happen. CLR James, to his eternal credit, even though it was a Trotskyist versus a Stalinist, he heaps one encomium over and after another on Robeson. And then he says at the end, leaving everything aside, his titanic gifts, his titanic achievements, he says the fact that stands out most about Robeson was he had, as the song has it, the whole world in his hands. He was actually the second most famous American in the 1930s after FDR in the world, the most famous American in the world after FDR. If you go to the Soviet Union at the time, there was a Mount Paul Robeson. If you go to India at the time, because he was close to Nehru, there was a Mount Paul Robeson. Robeson was omnipresent on the world stage. And CLR James says he sacrificed everything for his principles. He gave it all up. He had the whole world in his hand, and he sacrificed it all for his principles. And now you turn to the identity politics. I know this may sound like a crude standard. It may sound like a crude litmus test. But Ibram X. Kendi, sacrifice. Robin DiAngelo, sacrifice. Angela Davis, not the old Angela Davis, the woke Angela Davis, sacrifice? No. There's no sacrifice. There are people raking in the money, hand over fist, the toast of the town at the Aspen Big Ideas Conference, the toast of the town at the Hamptons, the toast of the town on the Upper East Side. They're not making sacrifice. They are raking it in. I find the whole thing contemptible.
And just one footnote to that. What you sent me, my dear brother, and I always appreciate what you send me, that Robeson and CLR James had a common context of struggle. So they got to know each other very well. That when CLR James wrote his magnificent play on Toussaint L'Ouverture, who did he choose to play Toussaint? Paul Robeson. So you laid that out right there. He's the director. He sees Paul every day. He sees how he relates to the folk on stage. He sees how he relates to the directors. He sees how he relates to the workers. When you have a common context of struggle, I mean, one of the reasons why he and I can sit up here and go at each other, because we had the same conversation in a 2.5-hour march in New York in a variety of other contexts of struggle. That makes all the difference in the world. And I think part of the problem, part of the challenge that Robin and the others were talking about is when you talk about identity politics, let's say, and it focuses on white supremacy and male supremacy and homophobia and transphobia, the genuine struggles against those evils must never be downplayed or erased, but there are going to be voices, strong voices, powerful voices, that say if you don't centralize class struggle, you're going to be weaponized by the bourgeois and neoliberal politics every time. That's part of the insight of your text. Am I right?
Totally.
Absolutely, you see. So, and that's why the heroes of this brother, Robeson, hey, Robeson in identity politics, but he is as black as Isaac Hayes and Nina Simone in terms of his beauty and integrity. We know he's struggling against white supremacy, and he's struggling against capitalism, and he's struggling against imperialism, ... That's where the big difference is. And it's been a major difference. And of course, you can imagine, I mean, a lot of this just goes back to Brother Bernie.
Totally.
Goes back to Bernie. For the first time, the most progressive community in the black community can't support the most progressive candidate running for president. That the black community can't make the move to support this particular secular Jewish brother from Brooklyn in Vanilla, Vermont. What's going on?
It also
some of you out there.
It happened with Mamdani. He only
Well,
got
he's still in
30%
process.
of the black
He's still in
vote.
process, though. We still, Bernie's over. It's 216, 220. No, brother Soran, he's a jazz man too. You watch how he's gonna start moving in this thing, and especially if he has the wisdom to bring some of us in to do what we can in that regard. But we'll see. You know, he's no messiah, but he's a strong young brother. He's only 33 years old. But the important point is that those historic opportunities that are missed, that's what part of the moral outrage and righteous indignation I perceive in your text. Occupy, George Floyd, so-and-so, missing those opportunities and then not saying a mumbling word about poverty, class struggle, and empire. Middle East, Asia, Caribbean, and so forth. Robeson didn't miss that. Now, Robeson being a Stalinist, he's wrong as two left shoes. Stalin's a gangster to the core. That's another discussion. Du Bois' essay on Stalin, Goodbye to Uncle Joe. Come on, Du Bois. No, I was born that night, but not last night. No, I know who Stalin is, but I'll take a bullet for Du Bois anyway. Because I know he loved me. And even though I have deep disagreements of him supporting the gangster, he, for the most part, was spending most of his time supporting the wretched of the earth. That's the kind of flexibility and at the same time honesty, it seems to me, that's required. And that's why I think your question is very important. One, in terms of both the power of his text, but also, on the other hand, when you get challenged by Robin Kelly and the others, what that corrective is. And in a way, the corrective is already in the text. It's just that he's just so upset about these bourgeois deployments of identity politics tied to just unbelievable cash and money and status and not a whole lot of sacrifice being taking place.
Or a substance.
Or even substance, but just, intellectual substance at that point.
Yes.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I didn't want to intervene on your behalf, though, brother, but that's just my luck.
The fellow next to you? Do you think you can get a mic? Is there a microphone? Because otherwise it won't.
This Sister Amanda on the way.
Thank you both, and to Nadine for all of this. I have deep admiration for both of you. This has been a real pleasure. And you'll have to forgive me if this has been touched upon, because I showed up an hour and a half late due to a train delay. With that said, something that has really been getting at me is this. I recently have emerged from, graduated from college. There was an active Palestine movement there. I thought a great deal about questions of academic freedom in relation to Palestine, and I've seen, the university very cynically weaponizes anti-Semitism to attack the Palestinian cause in really disgusting ways and all of that. And I've been outraged by it. With that said, the more time has gone on, I've realized that like the university as a site of struggle around this is just extremely limited, right? And at the same time as a lot of this stuff was going on at my college, I was engaged in two failed union drives with the janitor staff there, and very often I just found like that the Palestine people were like completely uninterested in what we were doing, and actually like were mad at us because we wouldn't sign on to like very particular statements they would make because like we were concerned about the security of the janitors we were working with. Why am I saying all of this? I'm saying this because, and I don't want to hurl anything at the Palestine movement, which has endured so much, bullshit, quite frankly, right? From the government, from universities and everything. I'm saying this though because I think that a major defect of the Palestine movement in this country is that it is largely concentrated among the PMC. All of the discussions that we're having concern like, academic freedom, which only applies to people who can attend these universities, and all of the discussions are being had in the context of mostly like elite universities that like less than 1% of people ever get to attend, right? The only way we're actually going to stop Israel's genocide is by organizing with the working class, and I feel that so many people in these environments and in the larger movement they're so like just consumed with themselves and self-referential that they can't realize like they can't recognize like what actually needs to be done to I don't know, like to really bring a stop to all of this carnage. And so I guess I don't know, it's not really a question, but like I just think like I don't know, do you think that the whole discussion of academic freedom, which I've really appreciated tonight, but do you think that it's really limited and that like we need to kind of branch out and think about concretely how to organize with the working class? I'm always thinking, in the vein of a great man of the last century, like what is to be done, right? What we got to actually do something, and it's not going to, whether or not Bill Ackman withholds hundreds of millions of dollars from these universities isn't going to fundamentally change anything. It's going to come from the organized working class. I'm sorry I went on for a long time, but sorry.
You go first.
You want to say? No, I don't know how much you saw, but the tape is available. Because it was a rich dialogue, my brother. And your powerful question was in many ways wrestled with in some ways. But I think I would both agree and disagree with you. I'll begin with my disagreement. I think that the struggle for Palestinian dignity and self-determination is in no way confined to the professional managerial classes or just corporatized, commodified universities. You see it on the street. You see it in the trade union movement. You see it in mosques. I'm seeing it more and more in churches. You see it in synagogues, prophetic Judaism, so forth and so on. So that is something that is much broader than something focused just on college universities. But professional managerial sites have always had their severe structural constraints and institutional limitations, but it doesn't mean you don't struggle there. Right, exactly. So we're agreeing, but I just don't want anybody to have the impression that you were saying the Palestinian struggle seems to be so very much focused on the professional managerial sites and university and colleges. And see, I think that it's not true.
He also said it's self-centered.
Well, self-centered, okay. Well, that's a different kind of claim. Yeah, that's a different kind of claim. Absolutely. So where I'm agreeing with you is I think all of these struggles have to have an internationalism and a universalism, and that has something to do with just truth, justice, integrity, honesty. And that's just old school, seemingly antiquated virtues, but they come back to haunt every movement. And if you don't have decent people who are willing to live and die for something, then all of this is just, empty language. You know what I mean? It's just tinkling cymbal. You see what I mean? So that what you're saying is true, but it's something that has to be executed in a variety of different contexts. Palestinians do have to be more attuned to other people's struggles. I say that all the time when I speak to them, when the Muslims come and ask me to speak and so forth. I say, where are the Muslims when it comes to mass incarceration, these police shooting down our precious children? Where are they? Not because I believe in quid pro quo. I don't believe in quid pro quo. But if you're going to be serious and consistent, then you got to be there too. And that holds across the board. Even in Iran, how do you deal with the woman life freedom movement when you got on the one hand the demonization of Iran, and then on the other hand you got struggles within Iran given the structures of domination? Where is the moral consistency without falling into the trap of the talking points of the State Department? Those are the kind of things that have to be hit head on. I'd say the same thing about Muslims in China. We can go on and on and on about dollars in India, as I said before. And they say, well, that's just empty, moralistic so-and-so. Call it what you want. Call it what you want. I'm concerned about oppressed people everywhere, even given the kind of powerful analysis that my brother has. He's concerned about oppressed people everywhere, too. We just have certain kind of disagreements about a variety of different kind of strategies and tactics.
Well, I've been asked to call an end to the proceedings.
You got to finish with your answer to the question.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay. No, I just want to make sure.
First of all, I think most of what you say is valid. I do. I would just say, make two caveats, qualifications. Yesterday, I had two visitors from Con Edison, two workers, who came to terminate my electricity and gas because I haven't paid my bill in 2 years in a protest. And I tried to convince them that I wasn't a quack or a crackpot. So I pointed out I've written many books, I'm literate, and they asked me, what's your specialty? I said, Gaza, and one of the fellows said, well, what do you think about Gaza? And he was obviously hesitant. And I said, well, I think it's a genocide. And he kind of sighed in relief. They were both African American, both gentlemen. And he said, you know, a lot of us feel that, but we're all so afraid to say it. And it registered for me that actually in this current round, the struggle has really percolated. It's way past academia and way past the professional managerial class and way past a handful of activists. You could just see it in the polls. I mean, if you look at the poll numbers, it's switched from plus 17 in favor of Israel in about less than 10 years, about 8 years. It's now plus 53 in favor of the Palestinians. The polling changes are just extraordinary. And if you watched Tucker Carlson's presentation at the Turning Points conference, Israel could not have been happy with those applause. Each time he attacked Israel, the applause are escalating and escalating and escalating. I think there were some problems with the applause, but these were young people at the Turning Points conference, and they're on the right. So it has spread. But you asked, I think, a lot of valid questions. You said, isn't struggles in academia, especially in Ivy League institutions, isn't that kind of beside the point? I wrote the book in large part to recall the value of freedom of speech, which I think had been lost because I knew the people, I saw them in academia. They were apparatchiks. They had the correct political line and you dissented at your peril. And I didn't think that was a good thing, having been an apparatchik in my youth, a Maoist apparatchik. And I didn't like to see how it resurfaced. So I get everything you're saying. I would just like to end, not because I feel obliged, but because it's part of the factual record. There are all sorts of reasons, even in these horrible times, There are really all sorts of reasons to be hopeful. A lot of people talk about Zoran Mamdani's charisma, his telegenic, and so forth. But what really impressed me about Mamdani was when I went out to canvass for him and I saw his army. His army was ages 23 to 25. I didn't think I saw another 30-year-old. I'm serious. The chasm between me in my age and the next person, you could fit the Himalaya mountains in between. And they were dressed, you might call, with nothing pejorative. They were dressed shabbily. You could see they don't go to gyms or health clubs. Very simple, but they know they're fighting for their lives. They're fighting for their futures. They're demanding a right to live. Not just breathe, but a right to live. And then I see this audience, which is, I would say, heterogeneous. And we've been here now for 3 hours. And I think of only about 5 people left. This is the era of the social media, where people's attention span is about 15 seconds before they have to switch to something else. They have to go back to surfing. But you stayed for 3 hours, no surfing, and as far as I could tell, I didn't even see anyone take out an iPhone. Out an iPhone. I'm looking here. Nobody took out an iPhone. And then I see my own students. I don't know how many of them are here this evening, but I still occasionally get to teach. And even though the social media, in my opinion, has been a human catastrophe of the first order, their minds, don't ask me how, because I can't figure it out, their minds remain very nimble. We have great discussions in class. They're lively, they're insightful, they're sharp, they're acute. The mind is still functioning, and functioning at a very high level, in my opinion, a high caliber. And then there was the Mamdani campaign itself. Those are they're inspiring moments, but they're also really grounds for hope. I would add one other thing. Nadine, myself, Cornel, we're roughly in the same cohort. It's called, euphemistically, senior citizen. And most of the people in the audience are young. And they sat through 3 oldsters pontificating. So there is, amidst all the horror, there's still excellent grounds for hope. And organizing workers, mobilizing for Mamdani, but also keeping him accountable and making him aware that if there's too much slippage, you're going to lose us. If there's too much slippage, you're going to lose us. There aren't structures, organizational forms. There's a moral force to keep him reasonably honest. So, Aimé Césaire, he was a Caribbean poet. He had a famous line which Edward Said liked to quote: "There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory." Now, I'm not going to live to see that rendezvous of victory, but I played my part. As I like to say, I did my best, which is the best that I can do. But there's every reason to be there are rational grounds to be hopeful that you will see that rendezvous of victory. I got an email from somebody in Upper New Jersey the other day. He's a former probation officer, and he said, I'm running on a campaign. Can you look for office? Can you look at my videos? Now, he subsequently informed me the lyrics for his videos were all done by AI. The music for all his videos were done by AI. But they did focus on the billionaire class, and that billionaire class has to be set aside or pushed aside. And so that's the consequence of the Mamdani victory. There was a famous slogan by Che Guevara in the 60s, 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. And now there's 1, 2, 3, there will be 1, 2, 3, many Mamdanis. And so I believe the younger people in this room have rational grounds for being hopeful that you will get that right to live, but it's going to be a very tough struggle. Very tough. And we have every reason to be concerned about how brutal that struggle will be in New York. As one person said, I guess he was a real estate mogul named Saul Reichler. He said, New York is the capital of capitalism. The capital of capitalism. Mamdani is not going to be the mayor of the city. It will be brutal if he sticks to his principles. So it's going to be a tough struggle, but speaking for myself, I welcome it. Good night.